The bloodstain was still there when the Hendersons first saw the house. Not that anyone mentioned it, of course. Janet Morrison, the real estate agent, had positioned herself carefully between the family and the dark patch on the deck boards, her clipboard held strategically to block their view. But Mark Henderson noticed it anyway. A shadow that looked too deliberate, too organic to be weather damage or spilled paint. Something had left its mark on this beautiful wraparound deck, and someone had tried very hard to scrub it away. "I know the price seems too good to be true," Janet said, nervous energy spilling out in rapid-fire explanations as the Henderson family took in the stunning ocean view. The house sat completely alone on this crescent of private beach, miles and miles from any other signs of civilization. But honestly, the isolation thing is a total deal-breaker for most families. People want neighbors. They want to see other houses. They get spooked out here. Sarah Henderson watched her 8-year-old son Tommy race down the wooden stairs and onto the pristine white sand below, her sneakers kicking up little clouds as he ran toward the water's edge. Her husband, Mark, was already examining the deck railings, testing their sturdiness with the methodical attention he brought to everything. The house was exactly what they dreamed about during those long Chicago winters. Spacious, modern, with those floor-to-ceiling windows that made the ocean look like a living painting hung on every single wall. "This is perfect," Sarah whispered to Mark, and he nodded, already calculating mortgage payments and property taxes in his head. Janet kept talking, nervous energy spilling out in rapid-fire explanations. The previous owners, they lasted maybe 6 months. Nice family, but they said it was too quiet. Before them, there was this couple from Boston, stayed about 8 months. They said the same thing, just too isolated, you know? Some people need the noise, the activity. But for the right family, she gestured toward Tommy, who was now building what looked like an elaborate sand fortress near the waterline. For a family that appreciates privacy and natural beauty, this place is absolutely magical. The first 3 days felt exactly like that. Magical. Tommy spent hours constructing increasingly complex sandcastles, complete with moats and towers and elaborate flag systems made from sticks and seaweed. Mark discovered his inner chef, grilling fresh fish they bought from a roadside stand 20 minutes inland, experimenting with marinades and spice combinations while the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah finally finished the novel she'd been struggling with for 8 months, sitting on the deck with her laptop, the sound of waves providing the perfect background soundtrack for her writing sessions. The house exceeded every expectation. The master bedroom had a balcony that looked directly out over the water, and they fell asleep each night to the rhythmic whisper of waves against sand. The kitchen was a chef's dream, with top-of-the-line appliances and a view that made every meal feel like dining at a 5-star resort. Tommy's room faced the ocean too, and he spent the first few nights pressed against the window, watching the moonlight dance across the water like scattered diamonds. "I can see everything from here," he announced on their second night, his nose leaving little smudges on the glass. The waves, the birds, the fish jumping, and that tall guy who likes to stand in the water and watch our house." Sarah looked up from her book. "What tall guy, honey?" Tommy pointed toward the water, his small finger tracing something invisible in the darkness. "He's really, really tall, like a basketball player, but taller and skinny like a stick. He just stands there in the water and looks at our house. He's been there every night since we got here." Mark walked over and peered out the window, following Tommy's gaze. "I don't see anyone, buddy, just the ocean." He ruffled Tommy's hair. "Maybe it's a piece of driftwood or something. Things can look different in the moonlight." But Tommy shook his head with that absolute certainty that only children possess when they know they're right and adults are being dense. "It's not wood, Dad. It's a person, a really tall person. He watches us, but he's not mean or anything. He just watches." Sarah joined them at the window, scanning the moonlit water. She could see the gentle roll of waves, the silver path of moonlight stretching toward the horizon, but nothing that looked remotely like a person. "Maybe it's your imagination adjusting to the new place," she suggested gently. "Remember when we first moved to the Chicago apartment and you thought you saw a dragon in the fire escape shadows?" Tommy considered this seriously, the way he always did when adults offered explanations for things he'd seen. "Maybe," he admitted, "but the dragon wasn't real. This guy is real." Mark laughed, the sound warm and reassuring in the quiet room. "Even if there was someone out there, which there isn't, they'd have to be standing in pretty deep water to be visible from up here. And why would anyone want to stand in the ocean in the middle of the night?" He pulled the curtains closed with a decisive gesture. "Come on, time for bed. Tomorrow we're going to explore those tide pools we saw on the drive in." They tucked Tommy in and returned to their own room, where Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her book. Something about Tommy's certainty bothered her, the way he'd described the figure with such specific details. Basketball player tall, but taller, skinny like a stick. And the way he'd said the person watches their house, like it was an ongoing thing, a nightly routine. Around midnight, she gave up on reading and padded quietly to the living room windows. The moon was full and bright, casting everything in sharp silver relief. The beach looked like a black and white photograph, all stark shadows and gleaming sand. She studied the waterline carefully, looking for anything that might have triggered Tommy's imagination. Driftwood, maybe, or a tall piece of debris washed up from some distant storm. And then she saw it. For just a moment, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, there was definitely something standing in the water about 50 yards from shore. Something tall and narrow and completely motionless, like a person-shaped shadow carved out of the darkness. Sarah blinked hard, rubbing her eyes, certain she was seeing things. When she looked again, there was nothing there but waves and moonlight. She stood at the window for another 10 minutes, watching, but the shape didn't reappear. Finally, she convinced herself it had been an optical illusion, maybe a combination of fatigue and Tommy's story planting suggestions in her mind. People saw what they expected to see, especially in uncertain light. It was a well-documented psychological phenomenon. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning brought the first real sign that something was genuinely wrong. Mark discovered them when he stepped onto the deck with his morning coffee, still wearing his pajama pants and that ratty Northwestern University t-shirt he'd owned since college. Wet footprints led from the shoreline straight across the sand, up the wooden steps, and all the way around their deck. Not normal footprints, though. These were elongated and narrow, with strange toe impressions that spread impossibly wide, like webbed feet stretched to their absolute limit. What the hell? Mark set his coffee cup down and knelt beside one of the prints. The wood was still damp, and he could smell something he couldn't immediately identify. Salt water, obviously, but underneath that, something organic and unusual. Not unpleasant exactly, but definitely not normal beach smell. Sarah joined him, studying the unusual markings. Each print was at least 14 inches long and maybe 6 inches wide, with those bizarre toe impressions that looked almost like finger marks pressed into wet sand. Could it be some kind of animal? She suggested, though even as she said it, she knew it didn't make sense. What animal walked upright and had feet this size? Mark traced one of the prints with his finger. Maybe a really big bird, a heron or something? They've got those long, skinny legs and widespread toes for walking in marshy areas. But the prints circled their entire house 3 complete times before ending abruptly at the water's edge, as if whatever had made them had simply dissolved back into the ocean. Sarah counted them. 67 individual footprints in total, each one placed with deliberate precision, never overlapping, never varying in depth or spacing. Birds don't walk in perfect circles around houses at night, Mark. Tommy appeared at the sliding door in his Batman pajamas, pressing his face against the glass. "Is that from the tall guy?" he asked, his voice slightly muffled. Mark and Sarah exchanged glances. Neither of them wanted to validate Tommy's story, but the evidence was literally right there in front of them, still damp with seawater. "We don't know what made these prints, honey," Sarah said carefully, "but we're going to figure it out." They spent the morning researching large shorebirds native to the area, examining photos and habitat descriptions on Mark's laptop. Great blue herons could indeed grow quite tall, and their tracks showed the wide toe spread they'd observed. But herons didn't typically approach human dwellings, and they certainly didn't walk in geometric patterns around buildings. "Maybe it's someone playing pranks," Mark suggested over lunch. "You know, trying to mess with the new people, fake some mysterious tracks, spook the city folks." Sarah wanted to believe this explanation, but something about it felt wrong. The prints had been too precise, too consistent. And there was that smell she couldn't shake from her memory, that organic ocean scent that seemed both familiar and completely alien. That evening, they took precautions. Every door and window got locked, and Mark even dragged a heavy bookshelf from the study to block the sliding door that led to the deck. "Just in case," he said. But Sarah noticed he kept glancing toward the windows as darkness approached, the same way she found herself doing. Tommy announced he was sleeping in their bedroom, and neither parent argued. He set up a nest of blankets and pillows on the floor beside their bed, positioning himself where he could still see out the window toward the water. Around 11:30, they all went to bed. Mark was snoring lightly within minutes, but Sarah lay staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of every sound. The house was old enough to have its own vocabulary of creaks and settling noises, and every one of them seemed amplified in the darkness. She found herself cataloging each sound, trying to determine what was normal house noise and what might be something else entirely. At exactly 12:47 a.m., she would remember the time precisely because she'd been checking her phone obsessively. She heard something moving on the deck. Not footsteps exactly, more like furniture being rearranged, heavy objects sliding across wooden boards. Deliberate movements, careful and methodical. Mark was already sitting up, his hand automatically reaching for the baseball bat they'd placed beside the bed after finding the footprints. The sounds continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly, followed by a silence so complete it felt almost aggressive, like the absence of sound was somehow intentional. They waited, barely breathing, until Mark finally crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains they'd drawn closed. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and Sarah's blood turned to ice water. She joined him at the window, Tommy stirring in his makeshift bed on the floor. Through the gap in the curtains, they could see a figure standing on their deck, impossibly tall and thin, its back turned toward the house. In the bright moonlight, Sarah could make out the basic shape. Definitely human, but stretched and elongated, like someone had grabbed a normal person and pulled them upward until all their proportions became nightmarish. The arms hung down past where the knees should be, and when it turned its head to look back at the house, Sarah saw a face so gaunt and angular it looked like a skull wrapped in wet paper. Tommy had been absolutely right. The tall man was real, and he was standing on their deck. The figure remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Head tilted at an angle that made Sarah's neck ache just looking at it. Every detail Tommy had described was accurate. Basketball player tall, but much taller. Skinny like a stick, standing in the water. Except now, it wasn't in the water anymore. It was right there, on their property, close enough to touch their windows if it wanted to. Mark grabbed the baseball bat and started toward the deck door, but Sarah caught his arm. "Don't go out there," she whispered urgently. "Call the police." But even as she said it, she knew how it would sound. A family of city people, spooked by shadows and creaking boards, calling law enforcement because they'd seen someone tall standing on their deck. The figure showed no signs of aggression, wasn't trying to break in or even approach the windows. It was just standing there, like it was waiting for something. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and walked toward the water, with movements that were too fluid, too graceful for something that size. It didn't stumble on the steps or hesitate at the sand. It moved like it knew every inch of this beach, like it had walked this path countless times before. Sarah watched, transfixed, as it reached the water's edge and kept walking. The waves didn't seem to slow it down at all. Water reached its knees, then its waist, then its chest, and still it kept moving deeper. When the water reached its shoulders, Sarah expected it to start swimming or turn back. Instead, it simply kept walking until it disappeared beneath the surface without so much as a splash, like the ocean had just absorbed it back into itself. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Mark paced the living room with the baseball bat, peering out windows and checking locks every few minutes. Sarah sat on the couch holding Tommy, both of them staring at the deck door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Tommy, surprisingly, seemed the least frightened of the three. "He didn't try to hurt us," the boy pointed out with 8-year-old logic. "He just looked and then went back to the water." When dawn finally broke, they ventured outside to examine the deck. More footprints, of course, but also something else that made Sarah's stomach clench with primal unease. Arranged on their patio table, in a perfect circle, sat a collection of sea creatures. Small fish, hermit crabs, pieces of colorful seaweed, and various shells, all positioned with deliberate care, like some kind of offering or artistic display. The fish were fresh, their eyes still clear and bright, scales still gleaming with moisture. The shells had been arranged by size, creating a spiral pattern that was actually quite beautiful. The seaweed had been woven together in intricate patterns that reminded Sarah of the macrame wall hangings her grandmother used to make. Someone or something had spent considerable time and effort creating this display, and they'd done it while the family slept just yards away. "It's like a present," Tommy said, leaning over the table to examine the arrangement more closely. Mark was already throwing clothes into suitcases. "We're leaving, right now, today." Sarah found herself nodding, though part of her felt ridiculous for running away from what might be nothing more than an elaborate prank. But another part, a deeper part, that connected to evolutionary instincts about predators and unknown dangers, was screaming at her to get her family as far away from this place as possible. They packed quickly and efficiently, years of family vacations having taught them to organize their belongings with military precision. Tommy protested, arguing that they hadn't even explored the tide pools yet, but Mark was beyond rational discussion. 3 nights of escalating strangeness had pushed him past the point where he could pretend everything was normal. As they loaded the car, Tommy spotted it first. "He's back," the boy said quietly, pointing toward the water. The figure stood waist-deep in the surf, perfectly motionless, watching them prepare to leave. This time, in full daylight, Sarah could see details that moonlight had hidden. Its skin had a grayish, mottled quality that seemed to shift and shimmer in the morning light. Its limbs were not just thin, but impossibly long, and when it moved slightly, she could see that its joints bent in directions that human joints simply shouldn't bend.
Mark had reached his breaking point. He strode into the house and emerged with the hunting rifle Sarah's father had given him as a wedding gift, a weapon he'd never even fired, kept locked in their closet back home for no reason other than family tradition.
His hands shook as he loaded shells into the chamber. His military training from 20 years ago suddenly reasserting itself. "Mark, no!" Sarah screamed, but her husband was beyond reasoning. 3 days of fear and helplessness had crystallized into rage, and all he could see was the thing that had been terrorizing his family, standing in their water, on their beach, threatening everything he was supposed to protect. The figure began moving toward shore as Mark approached the waterline, and Sarah felt her world tilt sideways. Up close, in broad daylight, she could see that it wasn't wearing clothes. Its skin was bare and had that strange, almost translucent quality she'd noticed from a distance. But there was something in its posture, something in the way it moved that didn't suggest aggression or malevolence. If anything, it seemed curious, cautious, maybe even frightened. Mark raised the rifle, his hands steadying as muscle memory took control. The figure stopped moving and stood perfectly still, as if it understood what was happening and was simply waiting for whatever came next. Its head tilted at that strange angle again, and for just a moment, Sarah thought she saw something almost human in its posture. Confusion, maybe? Or sadness? "Dad, don't shoot!" Tommy suddenly broke from Sarah's grip and ran toward the beach. "He's not mean, he's just watching. He brought us presents." But it was too late. Mark's finger was already squeezing the trigger. 20 years of military training overriding every rational thought in his head. The rifle cracked like thunder across the empty beach, the sound echoing off the water and the dunes behind them. The figure in the water jerked backward, dark fluid immediately spreading through the waves around it. It made a sound, not quite human, but not animal either. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside its elongated chest. And that's when Harold Wickham came running from behind the sand dunes, screaming like his entire world had just collapsed. Sarah would remember every detail of the next few minutes for the rest of her life. The way the old man's face looked as he splashed into the bloody water. The sound he made, a kind of broken howling that seemed to tear itself out of his throat as he cradled the impossibly thin body against his chest. The way he looked at them as if they were monsters that had just crawled out of some primordial nightmare. "That's my grandson," Harold sobbed, his voice cracking on every syllable. "That's my Daniel." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow to her chest, knocking the air from her lungs and making her legs go weak. Mark stood frozen on the beach, still holding the rifle, staring at the spreading patch of red water as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Harold Wickham, they learned as they waited for the ambulance that would never arrive in time, owned the property immediately adjacent to their rental house. He was 73 years old, a retired marine biologist who had spent his career studying coastal ecosystems. His grandson, Daniel, was 22, born with Marfan syndrome, a genetic connective tissue disorder that had left him extraordinarily tall and thin, with the distinctive facial features and elongated limbs that they had mistaken for something inhuman. Daniel was intellectually disabled, Harold explained through his tears, with the mental capacity of maybe a 10-year-old child. He was gentle as a lamb, fascinated by the ocean and marine life, completely incapable of understanding why anyone might fear him. He had been staying with his grandfather for the summer, the way he had every summer since his parents died in a car accident 5 years earlier. He loved seeing new people, Harold whispered as he held his grandson's body in the shallows, blood mixing with seawater and tears. But he was always too shy to actually talk to strangers, so he would watch from a distance. The fish and shells and seaweed, that's what he did when he wanted to make friends. He was trying to welcome you to the neighborhood. Every night, Harold continued, Daniel would wade into the water to watch for dolphins and whales. He could stay motionless for hours, and his condition made him nearly buoyant, able to stand in water that would be chest-deep for normal people. He knew these waters better than anyone, could navigate them in complete darkness, could hold his breath for impossible lengths of time. He wasn't a monster, Harold said, looking directly at Mark with eyes that held more pain than accusation. Sarah looked at her husband, who was staring at the rifle in his hands as if he'd never seen it before. She looked at Tommy, whose 8-year-old mind was struggling to process the reality of what had just happened. And then she looked at her own reflection in the sliding glass door of their vacation house and saw herself clearly for the first time. A woman so consumed by fear and prejudice that she had participated in the murder of an innocent young man whose only crime was looking different and behaving in ways she didn't understand. A woman who had seen a disabled person trying to make friends and interpreted it as a threat. A woman who had allowed her own terror to turn her into exactly the kind of monster she thought she was protecting her family from. Daniel Wickham died on the beach before the paramedics arrived, Harold holding him and singing the lullabies he remembered from Daniel's childhood. The official report would eventually classify it as a tragic misunderstanding, and Mark would face no criminal charges. The district attorney determined that any reasonable person would have interpreted the situation as threatening, given the circumstances and Daniel's unusual appearance and behavior. But Sarah knew the truth that would haunt her for the rest of her life. They had moved to a beautiful, isolated place, and immediately turned it into a scene of horror. Not because there was anything wrong with the place, or because they had encountered some supernatural threat, but because there was something fundamentally wrong with them. They had brought their fear, their assumptions, their prejudices, and their capacity for violence to a peaceful beach where a gentle young man had been trying to share his love of the ocean with new neighbors. The Hendersons left the beach house that same day, driving back to Chicago in complete silence, except for Tommy's occasional questions about why Daniel couldn't swim away from the bullet, why grown-ups always seemed to hurt people who were different, and why nobody had bothered to just say hello and ask Daniel what he wanted. The real monster hadn't come from the water at all. It had arrived in a packed car from the city, carrying suitcases full of assumptions and prejudices, and the kind of casual violence that people called protecting their family. It had stood on that deck with a loaded rifle, looking for something different to destroy, and when it found exactly what it was looking for, it had pulled the trigger without hesitation. The beach house was sold at a significant loss 6 months later, the real estate listing carefully omitting any mention of what had happened there. The new owners, a retired couple from Portland, never reported any problems with strange figures in the water, probably because they took the time to drive over and introduce themselves to Harold Wickham within their first week of residence. He told them about Daniel, showed them pictures, explained about his grandson's nightly swims, and his habit of leaving gifts for people he wanted to befriend. Years later, when Sarah would wake from nightmares about standing in that deck door watching Mark raise the rifle, she wouldn't see Daniel Wickham's elongated silhouette against the moonlit waves. She would see her own reflection in the glass, a woman who had become so afraid of monsters that she had turned into one herself. A woman who had taught her son that different meant dangerous, that unknown meant evil, and that the appropriate response to fear was violence. The Hendersons never returned to any ocean. Sarah couldn't tolerate the sound of waves anymore. They reminded her too much of the rhythm of Harold Wickham's sobbing as he held his grandson's body on that bright summer morning, when they learned that sometimes the most horrifying thing in the water is the reflection of what you've become when you look down into its depths and see yourself staring back.